In 2008, Dead Space introduced us to Isaac Clarke, an engineer forced to fight his way off a necromorph-infested spaceship. The game quickly racked up over 2 million sales, nabbed a handful of awards, and seemed set as the next big thing in survival horror. Dead Space 2 arrived in 2011, Dead Space 3 hit in 2013, and then nothing. While publisher Electronic Arts claims that Dead Space is still important to the studio, a sequel still hasn't happened. Here's why. Updated nightmares. You won't find Dead Space's unique dismemberment system or its silent zero-gravity set-pieces in other survival horror games, but for the most part, Dead Space plays it by the book. There's a creepy, atmospheric world, lots of enemies, buckets of gore, and plenty of jump scares. But horror gaming has changed a lot since 2008, when the first Dead Space hit consoles. In 2014, Hideo Kojima and Guillermo del Toro's playable trailer, PT, spooked players with haunting, surreal imagery, and shifting geography. 2017's Resident Evil 7 took the long-running franchise into a first-person perspective and dialed the action way back.
Now, I've seen everything. What the?
Soma is all about exploring and puzzle solving. Five Nights at Freddy's, a master of the digital jump scare, doesn't feature any fighting at all. In other words, modern-day video game horror is less physical and more psychological, and it's not clear whether an old-fashioned survival franchise like Dead Space is even wanted anymore. Jumping ship. Glenn Schofield, who created Dead Space, left Visceral and Electronic Arts in 2009 to form his own company, Sledgehammer Games. Wright Bagwell, lead gameplay designer on Dead Space and creative director on Dead Space 2, joined Zynga in 2011. Steve Papoutis, Visceral's vice president and general manager and the lead executive on all the Dead Space games, departed Electronic Arts in 2015.
We need more help. We don't have the resources to deal with this many cases. Nobody would tell us what's happening!
That's a lot of central figures who have left Dead Space behind. Of course, it's possible that a new crew could pick up where the old one left off. However, considering that a consistent complaint about Dead Space 3 was that the game moved away from its roots, it's hard to imagine that a new team could easily capture what makes the franchise special. Diminishing returns. According to the review aggregator Metacritic, Dead Space received average review scores between 85% and 90% depending on the specific console version. Dead Space 2 scored even higher, with ratings between 87% and 90%. Dead Space 3, however, only scored a cumulative 78% from critics. That's certainly not terrible, but it does mark a big step down from the previous games. Critics praised Dead Space 3's visuals and sound, but didn't like the game's move towards action and away from survival horror, and they didn't find the terrestrial setting as compelling as the series' usual space stations. If Dead Space 3 proved the franchise suffered from a case of diminishing returns, maybe it's kinder to put it out to pasture entirely. No more studio. Before Dead Space, Visceral Games made licensed video games under the EA Redwood Shores banner, cranking out titles based on The Godfather, The Lord of the Rings, The Simpsons, and James Bond. Dead Space was the studio's first major original intellectual property. Electronic Arts might own the rights, but Dead Space was really Visceral's baby. Unfortunately, Visceral's success didn't last. In October 2017, Electronic Arts shut Visceral down. Nobody's going to be as passionate about the Dead Space franchise as the studio that created it, and unfortunately, Visceral Games no longer exists. Losing touch. The first two Dead Space games are conscious throwbacks to movies like Alien and Event Horizon. Isaac, the series' protagonist, is a regular guy who must fight his way through infested, confined spaces. As Steve Papoutis has said,
"We really wanted Isaac to remain that sort of everyman."
For a major part of Dead Space, he's completely alone and uses tools, not weapons, to defend himself. But Dead Space 3 is different. In an attempt to reach a wider audience, Electronic Arts added co-op multiplayer to the main campaign. Suddenly, Isaac has a buddy, a stereotypically grizzled soldier named John Carver, with similarly stereotypical dialogue.
"We came to this frozen hole to stop the markers, and nothing, not you or your obsession with Ellie, is gonna get in my way. You got that?"
Worse, Isaac's clunky movement in the earlier games is replaced by the ability to dodge and seek cover. It might make for a smoother action game, but it doesn't feel like Dead Space. Overall, Dead Space 3 almost feels like it belongs to an entirely different franchise.
Bang, bang, bang. Bang, bang, bang.
Completely different. Maybe it's a good thing that Dead Space 4 never materialized. Dead Space 3 started pushing the series in a different direction, and apparently Visceral's plan for Dead Space 4 would have taken things even further. Instead of a linear crawl through a single spacecraft, for example, Dead Space 4 would have been an open-world adventure in which Isaac would travel between ships, leaving a trail of necromorph corpses in his wake. Creative director Ben Warnett told Eurogamer, "You'd start to form a picture of what happened in that region while fighting through scores of necromorphs from ship to ship, and you'd learn a new critical bit of plot info along with the means to shock to a couple of nearby sectors. In the end, Dead Space 3 didn't make enough money to justify another high-budget sequel. Maybe that's for the best. An open-world space salvage game sounds amazing, but is it really what people wanted from Dead Space? Probably not."
Isaac, we'll see you when you get back.